Well, welcome to the last event of the day, and I'm happy to introduce Steve Hayes. Now, Steve and I go back a ways. I think we're on the 20th year of Stephen Kirk's big adventure, we call it. And we've been involved in a lot of assorted activities within ACT and also outside of ACT, and in RVs and in the desert and various places. So Steve's a real precious person in my life, and he's also a precious person for all of us. And he's got a wonderful presentation today that I think you guys are going to enjoy. So without further ado, here's Steve.
Thank you, Kirk, and thank you, Bernard Parker, for a really beautiful start to it. My purpose today is to consider what I think is implicit in ACT RFT. I'm going to argue that while there's only a very small set of values that are explicit, a wider range of valued-like directions can be derived based on what we are learning empirically. And this larger set, I believe, situates our work in line with more ancient perspectives on human nature and development. From an ACT perspective, values are chosen qualities of an ongoing pattern of action. Another way to think of those is that they're gerunds and adverbs. They're not nouns. And like all gerunds and adverbs, they're manifest in an ongoing way. They can't be obtained like an object, but only instantiated in the moment. Now, I think it's important to keep track of our language games here. Many of these ways of speaking, including what I just said, are clinical, not yet scientific, and the scientific analysis of values is something that we're about. And I think a little bit more can be said if we try to put a more scientific language game frame on this. Scientifically, choice, speaking of choice, does not literally mean free choice. So we shouldn't reify that language. It's a clinical language. It means without verbal defense and justification. From a scientific point of view, the whole reason to do an analysis is we assume that we can at least probabilistically determine what it is that controls these things. But from the inside out, clinically, about as close as we can get to the truth is to say it's a choice. And scientifically speaking, without verbal defense and justification means, at least in part, is that we're not dealing with means to ends, but with ends themselves. Now, it's often said that science doesn't contain values, and I think that's very clearly wrong. At least from a contextualistic point of view, I'm going to steal what Kelly's been putting out on the web, and he's exactly right. What's true is what works, and what works is with reference to a stated direction or goal. And so there has to be values in the scientific work if it's a contextualistic enterprise, and they have to be explicit, as we've sort of worked out in some of the contextualistic philosophy. It's also been said that the main difference between science and religion is that religion can specify all its values a priori. And that seems basically correct, except for those needed to mount the scientific enterprise itself. And about that, we've been pretty clear. I think we really have done some work in working out what that might be. The explicit value of this kind of science is prediction and influence with precision, scope, and depth. A definition that I'm not going to really unpack here today. It's not my purpose, but that you've seen unpacked and written about if you've been following the ACT RFT contextualism literature. And this, I believe, is a value. It's a science value. It's an ongoing pursuit. It'll never be obtained. It can be instantiated. It's our purpose from the moment we embrace it. It's a path that we're following. It's a purpose. It can't be defended, I believe. It's one of those things that is done just by declaration, naked and in the wind. And it's not at stake, therefore, in the ACT RFT work, simply because the originators of the position made that declaration, and for the position to be the position, that declaration is part of it. That's what we're doing here. If you wanted to do something else, Here would not be a good place to be. But there's an even higher value than that, I believe, that's implicit in contextualistic science, which is, as I just said, the need for values themselves, because it's the only thing that allows this truth criterion of successful working to be established or to be implemented. ACT is based on this aontological contextualistic philosophy, which is why we can say things like there must be values in ACT RFT and they must be explicit. They come out of the philosophy of science. And philosophy of science is nothing more than making your assumptions explicit, owning them, and attempting to eliminate incoherence between assumptions that you may have. By extension, I think you could say this means that in contextualistic science we value values in science and in any area linked to truth. Truth is always local from a contextualistic point of view. But to the degree that you value truth in any domain, you value truth with reference to a goal, a value, which means, I think you could say, we value values in order to do our truth-making. So we can't work with individuals, groups, institutions, anybody, without doing so in the context of their values and our values, simply because we'd have no way to know how it is that we're doing, or even, in some deep sense, what we're doing. If you don't know where you're going, you won't know when you're getting there. So that gives us two explicit values that I see in this work, valuing values, and a specific scientific value of knowing in a particular way, the kind that's defined by our prediction and influence of our domain, which happens to be the whole organisms interacting in and with a context considered historically and situationally, and doing so with precision, scope, and depth. So we have a small number of terms precisely applied, and they move across levels of analysis, or allow coherence across levels of analysis. You can add a slight modification, it's kind of an obvious one, and a core ACT concept kind of makes it obvious, which is namely psychological flexibility, changing or persisting in behavior in the service of chosen values based on what the situation affords. Based on what the situation affords really means nothing more than given the prevailing contingencies. And it's a reference to the situated nature of effective action. In other words, psychological flexibility is a kind of effectiveness. It's one that is values-focused and situated. Now, it would be a contradiction in terms to value values without valuing the pursuit of values. And so having defined effectiveness of this kind, I think, is directly suggested by a values-based view of truth. So we need to just add a term to this. The entire set of a 2 or 3, you can turn them into 2 easily enough by just moving a word around. Valuing values, valuing effectiveness with regard to them, and the specific scientific value that we have inside this tradition. And that's it. As far as I can tell, that's it. Those are the only values inside the ACT RFT work. However, the concept of psychological flexibility itself begins to add something additional. And if you see it, the door is opened and expanded to a set of features of our approach that are not a priori, but are the result of the work that we've been doing. Values are not means to an end. But there are means that are so closely tied to ends that it's difficult to do one without the other. For example, it would be a contradiction in terms to say that you value the health of children, but you don't hold as important food and water for children. There isn't any way to have healthy children without having them have access to food and to healthy water. It's implied. Now, it's not the case that you say, I value food and I value water, but it's it's an empirical part of what it is that you say that you value. And you can discover that by actual investigation. It's an empirical matter. You may not have known that. I value health. You may know beforehand that food and water is involved, or a long list of additional things that we might find occurs as a result of our empirical science letting us know that health implies those things. Similarly, we label our term for effectiveness psychological flexibility. Why? Because broad and flexible repertoires seem to be needed to move in valued directions in a variety of situations. They are psychological food and water. breadth and flexibility. And once you see that, there's more to be said, because ACT has developed a set of psychological issues or categorical concepts that we are attempting to understand and that have emerged from our previous work as a result of this empirical conceptual work that we've done that bear on the particular kind of breadth and flexibility that we need in order to obtain values-based effectiveness. Now, we need a term for these things. I'm going to call them, with a considerable amount of fear, implicit values. I'm going to call them that because they're not values as we mean them, but they're so closely entangled and connected to it that they foster and enable those things. Now, if they're actually chosen by clients in the way that we speak about values normally, they become values pure and simple, but until then, they're based on empirical relationships, and they're not values in the full ACT sense of the term. To explore what I'm calling here, fingers crossed that it won't create harm to do so, implicit values, we return to a familiar site, at least for people who have been coming to these kinds of conferences for a while, but it's a bit of a shock to remember that this familiar site is only 3 years old. It was first promulgated on the listserv in March of 2003, which is the good old hexaflex. So-called, it was a joke, to call it hexaflex. It was tongue-in-cheek. It's a hexagon. It was about flexibility, and it seemed cutesy to call it that. And in the current era, where we are right now, it seems to do a pretty good job of summarizing some of the targets that we've been focusing on, two of which are acceptance and diffusion. We seek to promote contact with one's own experience in the present moment, without defense, fully, as it is, and to bring the functions of literal, temporal, and evaluative language in particular under contextual control. Acceptance and diffusion. They flow from our work non-arbitrarily, because the two biggest repertoire narrowing processes that we've been able to find so far and that we've argued are there, and it turns out empirically are there, are experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion. And so these two things are part of our psychological food and water. So what does it mean to take an accepting, non-judgmental, non-fused, evaluative, temporal, predictive, literal approach to your own life? What is that? And if you reflect on it, I think you can see that in an important sense of the term, we're talking about taking a loving and kind stance towards one's own experience. You can see it in the workshops. You can see it in your own experience. To do that is to hold yourself in a particular way, to hold your experiences in a particular way. And I don't really care about the terms, the words. I want to get to the core of it. But if you were to give it a voice, you could do a lot worse than to say it's a posture of love and kindness towards your own experience. They've always been defined, this kind of acceptance and compassion and kindness has always been defined as a critical feature of certain kind of loving stance, this more general sort of agape sense of the term. And in fact, other aspects of the ACT model fit in with that same term. If you look at the times where you really feel loved by others, you're probably going to find acceptance and a lack of judgment. But you're also going to find probably paying attention now in the moment, holding the other person and their experience as important. You're probably going to find valuing the person's effectiveness with regard to their own values. I'm here to sort of support and enhance your work. I care about you and what you really want in your life. When those things happen to you, you feel loved. And when you do those things with yourself, I'd say you're taking a loving stance with regard to your own experience. And without getting too sappy about it, I think you can say that love is an implicit value in our work. Not because it's a scientific or philosophical a priori. We didn't sort of jump into the work and say we're about love, but because on empirical and conceptual grounds, we just find that it's the psychological food and water that we need to do our work defined in this particular way. And held lightly, I think it's important, it's worthwhile to say that out loud. A pivot point for the expansion of this, having begun down this slippery slope I'm on, the pivot point for the expansion of this is thinking of a transcendent sense of self that part of the model pivots out a number of additional things, and I'll explain why. We've argued in our ACT-RFT that there are three senses of self: the conceptualized self, self as an ongoing process of knowing, and a transcendent sense of self that emerges from not just seeing and seeing that you see, the two things that Skinner and the behavior analysts have talked about, but doing so from a consistent context or point of view, namely I, here, now. And we believe, and we actually now have from the RFT labs evidence to show, that this is critical for certain kinds of things. For example, the ability to pass theory of mind tasks, to understand what's going on in the other. Now, contingencies work by selecting invariants, and we've argued that there are systematic invariants that help establish this sense of I as a context for the content of our lives. And all the way back to the 84 paper on spirituality, probably the first ACT-RFT article that was written. If you read it, you can see deictic frames are in there, the ACT-RFT links are in there, as we sort of tried to grapple with what it is that we were trying to do here. Rainer Sontag posted on the listserv a really neat graphical representation of this process of the contacting an invariant. So, for example, if you, through verbal conditioning, established the I eat X kind of frame, and the content varied, and a child learned to report their experience of eating, but not just experience, to report their experiences of hearing different things, but not just hearing, their experiences of seeing different things, but not just that, their experience of touching different things, but not just that, their experience of going to different places, and not just that, but their thinking of different things. Eventually you end up with, as you see the invariance across all of these categories, you end up with a lot of different content and one consistent context. From this perspective or point of view, verbal reports are made. And if you're not able to do that, you can't make verbal reports consistently. And little young children get confused before they have this sense of self. If you ask what they had for breakfast, they'll say what their brother had for breakfast. But eventually that gets weeded out because of the invariants that are in the contingencies of verbal reports themselves. And that's something we said in 84, and that we've done some research on, but we've done more research on something else that we'll have to add in addition to this. Now, this sense of self is key to acceptance and diffusion because it's not content focused. It's precisely what isn't that. It's context. And because of that, we're not talking about the conceptualized self, I as an object with features. We're talking about the place from which reports are made. Because of that, it's not threatened by or bound to specific experience, as that little exercise just showed. It's beyond that. It's the place from which all of those things vary, including, when we get into acceptance and diffusion, doing different things with that same content shouldn't be threatening, since after all, it's the invariant that goes off across all those different kinds of content, and as it varies across these different things you can do with content, it's not threatened because it's still the context of knowing, even for that. A transcendent sense of self, in that way, we've argued, is a naturalistic form of spirituality. I won't take you fully through the argument. I'll refer you to that 84 paper and writings that are based on it. But if you look up matter and spirit, you'll find that spirit is defined in the dictionary. It's one of those few that is defined negatively. It's not material. And if you unpack material, it's an event with a spatio-temporal limit. Something that's material comes from a root word for timber in English, and it means literally the stuff of which things are made. Events with spatio-temporal limits. Well, this transcendent sense of self is precisely the part of us that we cannot experience the limits of. It's not thing-like. Everything we're conscious of in the context of consciousness itself. I is everywhere we go. And because it's not thing-like, there's an experiential quality of transcendence, and it seems to me perfectly adequate to use the term spirituality for that. And it's not dualistic. It need not be. It's a direct description of a kind of experience that is not thing-like, that is no thing, that is nothing, if you choose to say it that way, or everything, that without distinction. So that seems to be another one. That seems as though, again, that not because we came into this as a scientific or philosophical a priori, but because on empirical and conceptual grounds it appears to be psychological food and water for the kind of flexibility we seek. Spirituality seems to me to be an implicit value in our work, not the dualistic kind, but the naturalistic kind, that a science can actually talk about, and more than that, investigate. Now, I think, again, that is necessary, as I said before, in taking a loving and kind stance with oneself and one's own experience, because it is the one place from which the attachment to content is simply not relevant. It's the part of you in which, that part of your repertoire that emerged only as context to those various the experiences defined in terms of content. But there's a bit more that we can say. Even in '84, when we were talking about this, we didn't have the name deictic frames, but we talked about the invariance, and we also talked about this kind of shift of perspective between I and you, and here and there, and now and then, and hypothesized that this sense of self emerged from that kind of thing, what we now call deictic frames. And in fact, we now have some evidence that it seems to be the case. It's preliminary evidence, but we have empirical evidence showing how this develops. We show that it relates to theory of mind, that you cannot pass those kinds of tasks of knowing what you see and knowing what you see and knowing how it's different if you haven't mastered these kinds of deictic frames. And we're beginning to see the training programs that go to children who don't have that sense of self, and by the way, importantly, as you'll see, don't have a sense of compassion for others as a result, we believe. And go in and train them through these kinds of deictic frames and see a sense of self emerge in which a particular kind of consciousness is possible, in which a particular kind of compassion is possible. Deictic frames, as all relational frames, are bidirectional. It isn't just I, it's I-you. And it isn't just here, it's here, there, and it isn't just now, it's now, then. And so in the training of relational frames themselves, what this means is that for humans to have a perspective on their own experience, it's necessary to have an appreciation for the perspective of others on their experience. They're one and the same. They're two sides of the same thing, the same exact psychological event. And thus said another way, for a person to become conscious in this sense, they have to begin to see the world from behind the eyes of others. Now this changes Rainer's exercise a little bit, because now we have not just I and all these invariants. We have I, you, and all these invariants. And as they combine in the language training we receive, the implications, I think, are a bit startling. I remember being startled when I saw them. Maybe they're obvious to you, but I saw it, which is to have a loving and kind approach to oneself, it seems to be necessary to have a loving and kind approach to others, and vice versa. You probably can't have it any other way, ultimately. But the deictics are not just I, you, they're also now, then, and here, there, and I'm not going to go through that with Rainer's, especially not after the misbehaving. But if the same thing hold, it means I can't separate. There's no psychological way that's healthy for me to separate a concern and a gentleness and a kindness for myself from a concern and a gentleness and kindness for others, and from here for others there, and for now for others then. There isn't any way for me to be present with and compassionate towards and concerned about my experience and not have concern for little Stevie who left when he's going to be my age. It's built in. Or for people in other parts of the globe, people that I may never see, but who nevertheless might be suffering. So taking a loving and kind stance with themselves then thus naturally tends to expand on its own accord to all people all places and all times. It has that quality. Yesterday, Mark Williams said, I asked him in this room whether or not there was values work that was explicit in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And he said, no, not really. But he said that the actual practice of mindfulness, in his talk, as you were there, as he goes through and unpacks not only his interpretation of mindfulness, but why what he called these modes of mind compete, he laid out almost point to point the same thing that we might say in different language. This really is a fellow traveler. But in this one area where he hadn't talked about it much explicitly, he said the actual practice of mindfulness seemed to lead to a spreading compassion for others. It just seemed to happen, even if you didn't target it. And I think the theory says why. The ACT-RT model says something like that seems likely. And the spread that's possible, the model says, especially from these four things on this hexagon model: acceptance, diffusion, contact with the present moment, and a transcendent sense of self, the spread is likely to be incredibly broad indeed. Now, there's a way to say this, and I don't know exactly how to language about it. I'm going to language about it in a particular way that doesn't deliberately echo other traditions, because I see so many ways that you could language about it. But that consciousness itself, considered this way, seems to imply compassion and concern for human suffering anywhere. Or stated in the inverse way, that it implies, now stated in a way that the Buddhists might talk about, joy in the joy of others and universally. It seems to imply that. A lot of words can be used, but it basically means the kinds of things that might be of importance to me: justice, equality, compassion, love, etc., tend to have an extension to others at other times and other places. And the feature that I want to point to here is this spreading process that's in deictic frames, I believe, so that my concerns for myself transfer to others and concern for others to myself. I'm just going to use universality for that feature in this talk. I don't know if I want to stick with it, but I want to use that here. A little more we can say. The social nature of consciousness can be languaged about in this way: a concern for relationships. If I'm concerned for others and their experience, it's a particular kind of relationship that I'm talking about between myself and other persons. I stand in relation to them. And to care in that way means caring about those relationships in a particular way. Now, I think the ACT model provides a model of what it means to have a powerful relationship, I believe. From an ACT-RT point of view, powerful relationships, I believe, are those that are likely to be accepting, non-judgmental, conscious, present, values-based, active, and flexible. They're going to be those that have those features that are in the core of the work that have emerged over time from what it is that we've done as we've done our ACT work. Now, most ACT folks care about how to include relationship sensibilities in their work. There's a lot of attention to relationship-focused issues, and there's a concern for things like FAP and so forth that help tell us something about how to do that. That's been true from the beginning. And I see now that it's not arbitrary. It's built into the model, that kind of concern. And it actually, if the model right, suggests that you will find both the targets, the context from the therapists themselves, and perhaps more importantly, that at the process level, some of the things that will function, for example, as natural reinforcers. Acceptance, non-judgment, consciousness, present, values-based, active, and flexible. Those are the things. When you are accepting a response to particular kinds of moves from your client, those are the things that are likely to function as reinforcers. For example, when you're non-judgmental, when you're aware, you're present, you are listening, when you care about what the person's experience are, and you let them know that it's your success that I care about. I'm not here for me. I'm here for you. And that are active and flexible. There's even some data in support of this idea. In our recent NIDA randomized trial of ACT, FAP, and Zyban, a combination treatment for smoking, with Barbara and Liz and a number of people, some of whom are here, who have worked on this, we found significantly better outcomes for that package than Zyban alone at a 1-year objectively monitored smoking cessation. And when you look at the mediational analyses, both the working alliance in therapy and smoking-focused psychological flexibility, acceptance, diffusion, valued action in this domain, both of those mediated outcomes. But when working alliance and psychological flexibility were allowed to compete for the variance, the measure of acceptance, diffusion, and valued action pulled the variance out of the working alliance. It was no longer significant. Now, what this tells me is the relationship is important. And what may be most important in the therapeutic relationship is modeling and reinforcing these very processes that our model is telling us is somehow central to human concerns and the establishment of a more flexible and effective and values-focused way of being in the world. There's something here, there's an interface between those two. Finally, one thing I'll return to is our explicit value of valuing values in the context of the whole ACT model now, having walked through it. Aristotle had a term for it. I've never heard it pronounced out loud, so you're going to have to tell me if it actually is eudemonia, but that's what it looks like to me. In any case, I only became aware of this in Aristotle's work and what's going on there more recently as a result of reading the listserv. I did go back and look at what Aristotle had to say. And he spoke of it as one of the highest forms of happiness and defined it as acting in accordance with virtue. Do you hear something familiar there? That when you actually are pursuing your values, and I would want to add, and the theorists in this concept probably would, if you look at the kinds of things that are out there in the literature, they include some of the various things that are in the rest of the ACT model. And so I think that's another one. We might just call it happiness. That way I don't have to worry about how to pronounce it. Now, I know I've done something dangerous here, and I just want to acknowledge that. I've done something dangerous. Because if we move from empirical workability based on our clients' values to shoulds about what clients should value, or anybody, we lose the whole point of the model. Because we're about empowering people to make those choices. It just so happens that in the empirical work we're doing, the model suggests that the things that are empirically healthy and supportive of that, once those choices have been made, have these features, I would argue. But that does not mean that you can then say, you need to be more accepting, or you have to have more compassion. Because if you do that, you're flipping the thing on its head and cutting at the heart of it. It's precisely because it is a choice to stand or not with your own experience, and to care or not about what you care about, that these things have emerged. So be careful, would be my caution. These implicit values, and that's why it's dangerous, is to use that same V word, inside our work are not the same as explicit values. They don't have the same kind of status in the work. And crossing that line is both, I believe, self-defeating and self-contradictory. But, nevertheless, based on this analysis, as we empower people to stand with themselves and to do what they value, a natural process, I believe, is set afoot. I believe we find that our science is about certain things, and contextual behavioral science seems destined to promote those things. And not just in the clinic, and not just in our schools, but everywhere where human beings go, in human culture. Not because we set out to do that, but because our analysis is carrying us inductively and empirically in that direction. It appears to me that our science will not just be about prediction and influence, values and effectiveness. It's going to end up being about love and spirituality and relationships and universality, and in the most responsible sense of that term, human happiness. That's what I believe our science is about. In other words, it is about some of the most ancient concerns of humanity, and some of the things that are most important to our spiritual and religious and other ancient human institutions. When Jackie and I gave a workshop before we were married in Tahoe, I did a meditation, which I'm going to ask you to do now, towards the end of the workshop. Just one of those eyes closed things. I think to do a transition from a break back to getting in the room. And Jackie, who's very, very perceptive, afterwards said, "I know why you said that." I said, "Oh, busted." I said, "I think it had something to do with me." I said, "Well, yeah, it actually did have something to do with you. Because on one level it was a meditation, and on the other level it was a love poem to someone I did not know then, but would marry and have a beautiful baby, and am very much in love with." So I would ask you if you're willing to do this goofy kind of act stuff. Heck, we started off with a beautiful flute. Can we finish with a little eyes closed deal? Would that be okay? I'm just going to go and do that meditation. And so I'd ask you to close your eyes and take a breath. And become conscious of the fact that you're here now in this room. And I'd ask you just to allow whatever shows up as they say these words. I will hold myself gently. I will hold myself in love. Not love as something I earned. Not love as a judgment, nor a conclusion. Not a plan, a decision, or hope. Not love as a manipulation, nor a wish. Rather, love as a choice, as an assumption, as a gift. Love as an action, a foundation, an essence, as an experienced reality. I am here now, and lovingly I care. Thank you. You may open your eyes.